Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, I'm Deidre Woolard with the New Books Network on the Economics Channel. I'm here today with Michael Albertus. He's a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. He's the author of 5 books. His newest book is Land Power: Who Has It, Who Doesn't, and How That Determines the Fate of Societies. Came out in January. It's this fascinating, comprehensive story of how land is power within societies, how it shapes power, how it changes over time. Just a fascinating book. Mike, good to be with you.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Well, the scope of this book is just massive. So you're covering really the history of land over time. So how did you conceive of this massive scope, and why did you need to take that type of viewpoint?
Well, you're right. It began as something that was somewhat more narrow quite some time ago, and then it expanded so that now the book ended up as something that is global in scope and that really covers the sweep of human history. And it grew over time. So the seed was first planted during graduate school at Stanford when I took some fateful trips to Latin America for my dissertation. I went to the highlands of Peru and Bolivia, and there the land was under everyone's fingernails. It was at the tips of their tongues, and people were tilling the soil, tending flocks of animals. But land wasn't just the source of subsistence in those places. It also determined what was politically, economically, and socially possible for people who lived on the land and for people who had left the land, but who had family heritage that was rooted in the land. And over time, I met people, that was some of the earliest work I did, but, I went back to the field both there and many, many other places since. And across that research, people presented lives that differed in very stark ways that were rooted in the ownership of land or the lack of ownership in land. And so I went back to Peru. I've been back a number of different times, but I remember a couple of instances that really presented me with this fundamental, division over land and this stark picture that was rooted in the land. So let me give you a story here. Between 2 different people. So one was a woman who I met outside of Cusco, about an hour and a half outside of Cusco. She was in her early 70s at the time I met her in a place called Huaran. And she had grown up in the context within the boundaries of hacienda, a large land holding that had roots even in the colonial era. And the landowner there, had incorporated over time a number of different settlements, and the people who lived in those settlements were impelled to work on that land. And so she worked on the land for the first several decades of her life in a relationship that was not that different from slavery. So she had to work, 6 days a week on the land. She wasn't paid for her time doing that. In exchange, she was able essentially to live where she was born. And she said that the landowner worked her and other people basically like a donkey, from sunup to sundown. So that's one, and I met her standing under the portrait in the ruins of this hacienda, standing under a portrait of the authoritarian leader who implemented a land reallocation program in the early 1970s. So for her, it was the trajectory of her life was this land policy. I met someone later who was a senator in Peru at the time and who had also been caught up on the other end of a land reallocation program. He was someone who lost land through that, under that same authoritarian ruler. And, his family had held enormous tracts of land between the Andes and the coast of Peru. And a lot of that land was lost, but the family was able to save itself through the social and economic power of land. And translated that into other venues for a period of time. They subsequently bought up some of the land they had lost, and he was sitting across from me in an exclusive, country club of Lima and telling me about how he was using his position as a senator, trying to reroute water from the Amazon to coastal areas of Peru that are much more arid in order to increase the value of that land. So it just showed the scope, the distance between those two was vast. And and it sparked in me this fascination in how human lives are so deeply entwined with the land. And I started to see this in other places where I did work, whether it was in, in places where I was traveling, Ireland, China, Portugal, Spain, South Africa, Mexico, elsewhere in Latin America, even in the United States. And so that's where the idea really came from, and that's how it blossomed over time.
That's fascinating. And it gets to that relationship with land that changes over time, which is so much of what the book is about, because you go all the way back to the beginning of how, first people live in places, and then gradually nation states start to build. And the first thing is, well, they start putting up boundaries. And over time, you see land power goes back and forth. You call it the Great Reshuffle. So tell us a little bit about those shuffles. You bring up one, the French Revolution, for example, and you just talked a little bit about what a land shuffle looks like in Peru. But tell us a bit about what a reshuffle is and some of the background of why that happens.
Sure thing. So the last 200 years marked this period of upheaval and ownership of the land that I call the Great Reshuffle in the book. It's hard to overstate how concentrated land became in places like Europe, Latin America, including Peru, as I mentioned, and in East Asia as well, as of a few centuries ago. And in the last 2 centuries, factors like population growth, state making, and social conflict all grew, and demand for land increased, along with the ability of governments to reallocate land and to reassign that land to new people. And that sparked enormous upheavals in who owns the land in societies across the globe. And I call it the Great Reshuffle because it came to mark nearly every country on Earth in fundamental ways. And at its core, land reshuffling entails taking land from some people and giving it to other people, right? So taking it from this senator who became, this person who became ultimately a senator in Peru, from his family, and giving it to the family of the person who was working on the land. So it comes in different varieties, and those varieties are unique and distinct. So there are, settler reforms that take land and oftentimes from indigenous peoples and give it to settlers on the land. There are what I call tiller reforms that hand land from, large landowners, landlords to tenants who are working that land. There are collective and cooperative reforms that take land from large landowners and then collect people together in groups to work the land. So there are different ways that land reshuffling can happen. In some cases, the reshuffles are rapid. You can think of China's land reshuffling after World War II, or Russia's land reshuffling after the Bolshevik Revolution, or land reshuffling in the context of the French Revolution. And some of those episodes involve violence, and sometimes pretty significant violence. But there are other major episodes of land reshuffling that are essentially peaceful and that don't involve much violence at all. Peru's reshuffling was a very big one, but involved essentially no violence, or very little. And on the flip side, reshuffles can sometimes move quite slowly. So if you think about reshuffling in the United States and the settlement of the United States, that happened first quite slowly on the eastern seaboard, and then it picked up pace and it accelerated as it moved west ultimately.
Well, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about one of those that you go into in the book, which is the Oklahoma land rush. You kind of set the scene, which is just fascinating, of these settlers just kind of rushing out to claim, 2 million acres of land. And this land, was not unoccupied. So, but all of a sudden, this territory instantly changes. So what's some of the background behind that, and then some of the after effects?
Right. So, Oklahoma was known as Indian Territory before it became ultimately Oklahoma. And there was a very fateful act in 1830, the Indian Removal Act, that started off the Trail of Tears and removing Native Americans from the southeastern part of the United States, west of the Mississippi, to what was then known as Indian Territory. And so that was, the first step in this process. Another step, obviously, is that as the United States then incorporated more land with the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, it acquired land all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, current part, Texas and California, Nevada, Utah, et cetera. That policy of Indian removal became untenable because there was nowhere to push people further west, because in the far west was an ocean, right? So, and settlers started to hop over territories in the central part of the country and in the eastern part of the West. And so all the way to the ocean. And so a new policy came to bear, which was reservation policy. And as reservation policy started, and there was the removal and the movement around of Plains Indians, the western part of what was then Indian territory, tribes were moved within Oklahoma, now Oklahoma within Indian territory, further to the eastern part of it, and then Plains Indians were put in that, in the western part of that, in part through reservations. And then there's a central buffer between those two groups within Indian territory and what became Oklahoma. And that was what became the target of the Oklahoma land rush in 1889, in which the government, at the shot of a gun, 50,000 settlers, people who had lined up to claim land, rushed out into territory and in the course of one day, basically claimed nearly 2 million acres of land that had previously been, land that was, pertaining to indigenous peoples. And that required, this kind of insatiable demand for land. It required settlers who wanted to farm that land and access that land. It required the appropriation of land from indigenous peoples and its ownership or ability to assign that land by the federal government, and the capacity to roll out this process of new land allocation. And ultimately, it cemented in the dispossession of Native Americans from that land, and it created a sea of smallholding in places where there had previously been, somewhat looser territorial relationships with the land. And ultimately, it fostered a racial hierarchy in the American West, with white settlers at the top and indigenous peoples at the bottom. And I should say that it's worth mentioning these issues are still disputed. It's not something that just happened a long time ago and no one thinks about it anymore. There was a landmark Supreme Court case, for example, McGirt versus Oklahoma in 2022, regarding tribal authority over prosecuting crimes in Oklahoma. And so these are issues that continue to be explored today, continue to be litigated today and contested today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even in our current political climate, there's a lot of talk about what's going to happen to, some state-owned land. And, I'm thinking about the Great Reshuffle and that sort of 200-year period. You have all of this colonization and there's this land grab. But one of the things you point out in the book is, countries will just grab land and then they kind of don't know what to do with it. They don't know what the land contains. They don't understand the people. They don't know about the resources. And they kind of need to make it worth it, make it pay. So there's sort of a cycle that starts then of like having the land and then trying to figure out what to do with it.
Right. And that's particularly true of colonization, especially, right? Where you're sending settlers to lands that are initially unknown, right? So you can think about that in the U.S. with the early settlements in New England. You can think about the settlement of coastal Australia, or even exploration in the New settlement in the New World throughout Latin America by the Spanish and Portuguese empires. And so you have colonizers who are coming to these places who are encountering populations, and at the same time, they have these views that indigenous populations are inferior, that they're less deserving of land, that their culture is not as advanced as European ones. And colonizers ultimately, in many cases, do not understand the relationships that indigenous peoples have to the land. They don't recognize or see those relationships to the land through any lens that they can understand when it comes to things like private property, and individual, making boundaries in the land and assigning land to individuals. And so colonizers continually pushed people off the land. They continuously push groups off the land. Of course, diseases and the like helped with that process by really decimating, native populations in many cases. But ultimately, colonizers took the land, and then they used new landholding patterns. They imposed their own forms of property rights, their own forms of landholding that were in some cases transplanted from the old world. In other cases, new forms arose, like the encomienda and the hacienda, for example, in Latin America. And those new landholding patterns were used to diminish indigenous peoples and their cultures and to break up those societies. and ultimately created enduring racial hierarchies in these places as well.
Yeah, that was one of the themes I noticed in the book. It's not just, it's the racial and also gender hierarchies. One of the things you talk about in the book is landholding in Canada for women and the battle for women to own any land there. You also share in the book how Bolivia righted some of their land wrongs. Tell us a little bit about that pathway.
Right. So the social, political, and the economic power of land means that it cuts deep ruts within societies along major identity markers like gender and race. And in the case of Bolivia, Bolivia fits this broader pattern of Latin American, colonialization. There was extreme landholding concentration after colonization in Bolivia. And like in Highlands, Peru, the near enslavement almost of the indigenous population. Indigenous communities were effectively enclosed within these haciendas and owed their labor to the people who ultimately came to own that land. There was then a push to reallocate and reshuffle land. There was a revolution in Bolivia in 1952, and that set off a multi-decade effort to take land from people who had received it through the colonial project or its aftermath, and to grant it to people who lived on the land and people who worked on that land, including indigenous communities who worked on that land. Bolivia has an overwhelmingly indigenous population. And that's what happened. But land was given mainly to men. It was given to heads of household. And in a society with traditional gender relationships like Bolivia at the time, that meant that land was essentially completely given over to men. But like in many episodes of land reshuffling, there were not property rights associated with this reshuffling of land, especially when it happens under authoritarian regimes, as it did in Bolivia. People received land, but people didn't receive property titles and the like to their land. So they couldn't, their land wasn't necessarily registered in their name, et cetera. And so that generated this, kind of fog of murky property rights. It wasn't entirely clear in every case who owned what, and furthermore, it was hard to prove it. So that generated, and that lasted up until the 2000s even. And when Evo Morales and his political party MAS came to power in 2006, one of their big projects and initiatives was to start formalizing land, i.e. titling land, registering land, delimiting its boundaries, and that sort of thing. And, at the same time, their indigenous social base empowered women to a greater degree than had ever occurred before within ruling coalitions in Bolivia since its independence. And in fact, the leader of the new Constituent Assembly that was charged with drafting a new constitution under Evo Morales was the social activist Sylvia Lazarte. And she helped to push forward this agenda of titling land jointly with women. And so, in other words, rather than register land in the names solely of men who received it sort of de facto in the aftermath of the land reshuffling, that it should be registered in the names of both men and women jointly. And that ultimately was quite deeply empowering. And so indigenous women like Lazarte took positions of unprecedented political power alongside men and gained a stronger voice in community governance and community affairs. There's still a lot of discrimination against women in Bolivia, but there's also greater respect. Women have a greater ability to have a say in household affairs. They're more secure when it comes to the death of a spouse, or when it comes to issues of land inheritance and like. And they're able to work alongside men in positions of power and authority in ways that would have been really hard to imagine, even as early as the early to mid 2000s. And land is a really big cornerstone of that historic shift within society.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought about it also in terms of women in the U.S. and real estate, and that like single women are now starting to own property far more than single men. So I think there's something that connects there with land and its ability to, confer wealth and status.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's something that's really important. And, you mentioned the Canadian example as well. And Canada, like the United States, had a Homestead Act. But in the context of Canada's Homestead Act, known as the Dominion Lands Act, that was instituted in 1872, the government reallocated, hundreds of millions of acres of land from Ontario all the way to the Pacific coast, and that land essentially, almost all of it went to men. And as a result, we see that women were disempowered by that they didn't have the same sorts of opportunities, and we can see that reflected in older women who live in those parts of Canada even today. And so it's something that has a long shadow. And then, of course, even as people move to cities, that shadow comes with them oftentimes. And so, yes, it's something that's really important.
I was fascinated about in the part about China in the book. I didn't know much about China's history with land, and it's long and fascinating and often problematic. So tell us a little bit about the various reforms it went through.
Right. So China, before land reshuffling in the 1940s and 1950s, was a society where, not quite as unequal perhaps as, let's say, Latin America was before land reshuffling, but still there was quite a lot of land inequality, and landlords were in the driver's seat. And many people were landless or worked as were renters and worked on land as tenants. And there was a communist insurgency that sought to overturn that under Mao Zedong. And that insurgency snowballed and ultimately took over the country after the Chinese Civil War, pushed the nationalists over to Taiwan, and the Chinese Communist Party came to power. And in the late 1940s, they seized all private land in the country. They nationalized it. And then several years later, they would form collectives on the land. It was an enormous program of land reshuffling. Over 90% of the country's population, hundreds of millions of acres of land, were impacted by these policies. And it was the largest experiment in land reshuffling in human history. It affected about 430 million peasants. And it had massive implications for the country's development, and it had huge implications as well for the country's environment. So this is one thing that I talk about in the book, that as the land reform moved and the land reshuffling moved from northern China to southern China, and the late 1940s and the early 1950s, people who were in southern China saw it coming, and they decided that, they knew that they were going to lose the land that they had. And as a result, they tried to take what they could from the land. And that involved things like deforesting the land, trying to cut trees down from the land and sell timber and the like. And then there was another, as land for a brief time went to families, and then people were pushed into collectives in the mid-1950s under Mao. And that episode, again, people were pushed off their land. People had received land, were pushed off of it. They, again, started doing things like deforesting the land. So there was more, more cutting of trees and for timber and the like. And then, collectivization was used to jumpstart industrialization in China. And Mao aimed to produce 11 million tons of steel right out of the gate in order to catch up with Great Britain in terms of industrialization. And, the population was overwhelmingly rural at the time. And so collectives were a key source of resources in order to kickstart industrialization. And the control over collectives then enabled the communists to force people to do things like make makeshift backyard furnaces and melt down agricultural equipment and cooking utensils and other items in order to make steel. And people had to burn wood in those stoves. And again, that meant more deforestation. And that was, a bigger round of deforestation than had even occurred previously. And it left many people without the basics that they needed to be productive on farms. And the government got what it wanted in terms of steel, but they wanted more. They wanted more agricultural production. And because of the disruptions that this caused, there was sagging agricultural production. And, that was combined with some, short-term drought and the like. And as a result, the government came up with this plan to try and kill pests in rural areas in order to increase the harvest. And that meant one of the edicts was became known as the Great Sparrow Campaign. And there was this, message that was sent down to try and kill all the sparrows because sparrows were eating crop seeds. And And people did. There are stories of people, banging pots and pans for days until sparrows were, falling out of the sky in exhaustion. And it killed millions and millions of birds. And it upset the ecological balance in the country and led to this explosion of locusts, which, guess what, ate up all the crops, right? So, and contributed to the Great Famine, costing some 30 million lives. There are, and so you can kind of go on and on and on with this, the attempt to manipulate production, the environment, et cetera, all through the land, and generating these huge problems and, for a broader society and for the planet.
Well, and there's a difference too in working the land you're on versus working the land you own, and how much agricultural productivity happens, whether you're just working land or whether you're working land that you own and that you get to keep the benefit of.
Of course. Yeah. And there are many stories of this. This is why, collectivization in most cases has ultimately failed in the end, because there's typically a relatively loose relationship between work and compensation. And so that generates disputes over who should get access to what. It generates poor incentives for producing on the land, for spending time on the land. It generates shorter time horizons since you don't know what you're necessarily going to get out of it. All that generates these distortions that make people less productive ultimately on the land. And that, China recognized that. And after the death of Mao, land was decollectivized, and, it was broken up. It wasn't broken up entirely. Villages still own land. There's still not private rural land ownership in China, but people now have access, and families have access to particular plots of land, and they effectively have something like long-term leases to these lands and farm them now more as families. And so, that generated an agricultural boom since. And that shift in property rights has been a key part, actually, of China's growth story in the last several decades.
Well, I think one of the reasons this book is important and really had me thinking is the relationship with land power and how it changes over time. You first agricultural, then you mentioned steel. Right now, we're in this space of rare minerals or places to put data centers, and this AI crunch. How do you think land power is playing out in our world right now in terms of that?
Right. I see land as still conferring its owners with substantial power, economic, social, and political power. Land is foundational even in an economy that moves away from agricultural labor, because land still hosts valuable resources. It's still needed for placing these data centers, for placing solar arrays. It's still used for food production. One maybe statistics that might surprise some people is that a third of all land area in the United States is used for feeding and raising cows, basically, because of the massive amounts of beef consumption in the U.S. And that's not going to change overnight, even if the economy changes overnight. Land is also key to understanding housing and the housing crisis. Land makes up, about 40% of the value of housing on average in the United States. And it's substantially more in some places. In places where housing is relatively expensive, typically it's because land is relatively expensive. Land makes up about 2/3 the value of housing in parts of the Bay Area, for example. So those are all reasons why land is still, the most valuable asset on Earth at about $200 trillion, and why it's still so important. Of course, people now move around more than they used to on the land, and multi-generational homes and local family networks have eroded in different ways. And that erodes the connection to place and its links to identity, even though those still do remain, of course, for many people. But there's also now a rise in institutional investing in land and billionaires owning land, treating land as a market treats land as a market commodity. But it also shows the enduring attractiveness of land and of land power, ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people don't know that Bill Gates is one of the biggest investors in farmland.
Sure. Yeah. And he's not the only one. There are a number of billionaires who are increasingly investing in farmland. It's a great hedge against inflation. It's used for portfolio diversification for people who might have more of a tech background or something like that. But yeah, that's exactly right. There's more and more interest in these areas.
Well, last question for you. I know you've written some pieces recently on natural disasters. We're seeing so much of it in the U.S. Maybe climate change starts pushing us inland. Certainly wondering about those repercussions. Like one of them, I know in the Miami area, you've seen people moving inland more toward like Little Havana and areas that have been owned by people, and maybe that land wasn't as valuable before as it is now. I'm wondering, what's your hope for the future on how both nations and individuals wield land power in what might be a time when certain types of land become more desirable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Climate change is really around the corner on this, and rising seas and coastal storms, as you mentioned, are already starting to force people to move inland. And that's going to be an increasing trend. That you've got a couple options. You can move inland, or you can invest in seawalls and dikes and that sort of thing, which are very expensive. But even that is a stopgap ultimately until climate change is, ultimately, slows and the seas stop rising. So we're just barely starting to see the beginnings of this, but it's going to increase. That's going to change land markets. It's going to change land markets in places like Miami, which is anticipated to be 60% underwater by 2060 and 100% underwater by 2100, unless they start building dams and seawalls, I mean. And so that's going to change land markets. It's going to change land markets in those places. It's going to change land markets in the places that people ultimately move to. That's going to lead to a repricing of insurance in these places. I think already insurance markets in Florida and California, private insurance markets are effectively collapsing, and the state is starting to have to step in as an insurer of last resort. And insurance, more and more people are going without insurance in these places, and as losses stack up, people are not going to continue to do the same thing. So at some point, this is going to unwind, probably in the next several decades. So not that far from now. So that's going to be, that's just one example, but there are many examples. You could see this in the LA wildfires and other examples too. And so, I hope that in the future, in terms of how people can wield land power, how countries can wield land power, I hope that it can be used for good and on many different dimensions. So, the environment is one of them, since it's what we're talking about right now, repairing the natural environment, conserving biodiversity for future generations in places where there still is rich biodiversity, for trapping carbon. There are things like, the permafrost that's slated to melt at increasing rates, well before the end of this century. And so, that's a pressing concern right now. I also hope that people in countries use land power for to address transgressions from the past, things like rethinking how we relate to and what we owe to indigenous peoples on the land, and moving forward with arrangements like co-management and co-stewardship of land, and even perhaps land returns in some cases, or land reparations. I hope that, more societies do moves like Bolivia, which is to say that empower women to own land, and in so doing, empower them socially within the household, empower them, politically, empower them economically, to take greater leadership positions within society, and have more upward mobility and opportunity. I hope that countries use land for development as well. So, land has been an enormous, and property rights over land have been a critical tool in transitions to development and to raising people out of poverty. And it's done so for many millions of people around the globe. So I hope that land power can also be used to push that agenda forward as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Mike, thank you so much for your time. The book is Land Power. It is a great read.
Thanks so much for having me on. It was a pleasure to talk.